Imagine gargling imported human pee to get white teeth or wiping your butt with a community sponge on a stick that your neighbor just used. History was filthy, dangerous, and honestly hilarious. Smash that like button and subscribe right now if you have a strong stomach, because we are diving into the 111 dumbest ancient hygiene practices that will absolutely make you gag. 1. Imagine being a wealthy lady in the 18th century who decided her eyebrows were not furry enough for the fashion trends. You might think she would grab a pencil, but instead, she grabbed a mousetrap because beauty standards were wild. Women often lost their real hair due to using toxic lead makeup, so they came up with a stomach-churning solution. They actually trapped mice and skinned them to harvest the fur, which they glued directly onto their foreheads using sticky tree gum. It looked fantastic until the summer heat melted the glue and your eyebrows slid down your face or started smelling like a dead rodent. 2. Being close to the King of England was the ultimate honor, but this job took intimacy way too far for modern standards. The Groom of the Stool was actually a highly coveted position for high-ranking noblemen who desperately wanted political power. Their entire daily responsibility was to follow the monarch around with a portable velvet toilet and a clean towel. When the king finished his royal business, the groom had to physically wipe the royal bottom. It sounds absolutely humiliating to us today, but back then, people fought for this dirty privilege. It meant you were the only person alone with the king during his most private moments, which was worth the terrible smell. 3. You might think your minty mouthwash burns a little, but the ancient Romans had a much worse way to freshen their breath. They believed that the ammonia found in human pee was the perfect chemical to whiten their teeth and prevent decay. It became such a massive trend that they actually imported barrels of urine from Portugal because they thought it was stronger and more effective. Imagine waking up in the morning and gargling a cup of stale stranger pee before kissing your spouse. It technically worked to clean stains, but the smell must have been absolutely horrific. Wealthy Romans walked around with bright white smiles and the worst breath in history. 4. In the Roaring '20s, American women were told that the secret to a happy marriage was smelling fresh down there. Advertisements everywhere convinced ladies to use Lysol as a feminine douche to kill germs and keep their husbands happy. This was the exact same toxic chemical used to scrub factory floors and kill bugs, but nobody seemed to care. Women were literally pouring caustic poison into their most sensitive areas, causing severe burns and poisoning. It remains one of the most dangerous marketing scams in history. The company eventually stopped suggesting it for bodies, but for decades, women suffered in silence just to follow a terrible hygiene trend. 5. The next time you complain about single-ply toilet paper, just remember what the early American colonists had to use in the outhouse. Before soft paper was invented, the most common wiping tool sitting next to the toilet was a basket of dried red corn cobs. You would pick up a hard, scratchy vegetable skeleton and scrape yourself clean after using the bathroom. It was rough and painful, but it was free and plentiful on every farm. If you were really lucky, you might get a soft handful of moss, but usually you were stuck with the cob. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase roughing it. 6. Victorian women were obsessed with having a tiny waist, and they would do absolutely anything to stay thin without dieting. The most horrific solution was swallowing a pill that contained a live cyst of a beef tapeworm. The idea was that the parasite would hatch inside your stomach and eat your food for you, so you never gained weight. Women walked around hosting a 30-foot monster in their intestines just to fit into a corset. It worked for weight loss, but it also caused malnutrition and nausea. To get rid of it, you had to dangle a bowl of milk in front of your open mouth to lure it out. 7. Queen Elizabeth I was the ultimate fashion icon, but her beauty routine was a slow suicide mission. She wanted her skin to look dead white, so she spackled her face with a thick mixture of white lead and vinegar. This toxic paste hid her smallpox scars, but the lead was slowly poisoning her blood and eating away her skin. It created a vicious cycle where she had to apply even more layers to cover the rotting flesh underneath. By the end of her life, she had inches of makeup caked on her face. She looked like a porcelain doll, but she was decaying while she was still alive. 8. London is famous for fog, but in the summer of 1858, it became famous for the smell of human waste. The River Thames was basically a giant open sewer where millions of people dumped their toilet buckets every day. The heat wave that year cooked the filth until the stench was so powerful it physically sickened people miles away. It got so bad that the British Parliament had to soak their curtains in chloride just to breathe during meetings. They eventually fled the building because no amount of perfume could hide the smell of a city drowning in its own poop. It forced them to finally build sewers. 9. In the early 20th century, people did not understand radiation and thought it was a magical energy booster. A wealthy socialite named Eben Byers started drinking a radioactive medicine called Radithor every single day to cure his arm pain. He bragged about how great he felt and drank over 1,000 bottles of the glowing water. The radium accumulated in his bones and slowly ate them away from the inside out. One day, his entire lower jaw literally fell off his face because the bone had dissolved. He died a slow, painful death and was buried in a lead-lined coffin that is still radioactive to this very day. 10. If you think sharing a toothbrush is gross, you will not believe how families use the everlasting pill. Doctors often prescribed a heavy metal ball made of antimony to force patients to vomit out their sickness. You would swallow this metal marble and wait for it to violently purge your stomach contents. The crazy part was that the pill was expensive, so you did not throw it away after one use. You would fish the pill out of your vomit, wash it off, and put it back on the shelf. The same pill was swallowed and regurgitated by every family member for generations. It was a family heirloom of pure disgust. 11. If you think fashion victims are a modern concept, you haven't seen the lethal green dresses of the Victorian era. A vibrant emerald color became the obsession of every high society woman, but the dye was made with massive amounts of arsenic. Ladies wore these gowns to parties while the fabric slowly released toxic dust into the air they breathed. It caused terrible skin ulcers and made them vomit blood, but they kept wearing it because it looked so pretty. The dressmakers suffered even more as their hands rotted from handling the poisoned fabric daily. It gives a whole new darker meaning to the phrase "dress to kill," because these gowns were literal murder weapons. 12. Modern CPR is stressful, but at least your doctor doesn't try to blow smoke up your rear end to save you. In the 1700s, doctors believed that tobacco smoke was a magical stimulant that could revive the dead. If a person almost drowned, the physician would grab a special bellows kit and pump thick smoke directly into the victim's rectum. The idea was that the warmth and nicotine would shock the body back to life from the inside. They actually lined up along the river waiting for drowning victims. It did absolutely nothing to help breathe, but it certainly gave the poor unconscious patient a very surprising wake-up call. 13. We complain if we see a few crumbs on the carpet, but medieval floors were actually designed to hide filth. Instead of cleaning the stone floors, people covered them with thick layers of dried straw called rushes. When food scraps or dog vomit hit the floor, they just threw a fresh layer of straw on top to cover it up. This lasagna of garbage would build up for years, creating a warm home for rats and fleas right under the dining table. The smell was so bad that when they finally cleared it out, people often fainted. It was basically living on top of a compost heap inside your own living room. 14. Taking a shower usually involves water and soap, but ancient Roman athletes preferred to scrape themselves clean, like a dirty pan. After working out in the dirt and sweat, they would cover their entire bodies in thick olive oil. Instead of rinsing it off, they used a curved metal tool called a strigil to scrape the oil and grime off their skin. The result was a disgusting slurry of sweat and dirt, which they oddly sold as medicine. It sounds exfoliating until you realize they were dry, scraping their skin raw. It was less like a bath and more like peeling a potato, except the potato was a sweaty wrestler. 15. Men have been insecure about losing their hair for centuries, but the cures back then were much smellier than Rogaine. In the 17th century, a popular medical book recommended a potent mixture to bring back a receding hairline. The recipe called for mixing fresh chicken poop with potassium and rubbing it vigorously onto the bald scalp. The idea was that the heat from the dung would stimulate the hair follicles to grow again. Gentlemen walked around smelling like a barnyard, hoping for luscious locks, but only got infections. It never grew a single hair, but it definitely succeeded in keeping people far away from your head. 16. If you need false teeth today, you get clean porcelain, but In the 19th century, you got secondhand body parts. Rich people wanted dentures that looked real, so dentists sourced them from the freshest supply available, which was dead soldiers. After the Battle of Waterloo, scavengers ran onto the field to rip the teeth out of thousands of fallen young men with pliers. These teeth were boiled and set into ivory bases for wealthy aristocrats to wear at dinner. You were literally chewing your food with the teeth of a man who died in agony. It was the ultimate recycling program, but entirely too grim for anyone with a conscience. 17. We panic if we forget to brush our teeth, but our ancestors were brushing with actual garbage from the fireplace. Before minty toothpaste existed, people believed that abrasive powders were the only way to scrub off plaque. They would take burnt bread crusts or straight black soot from the chimney and rub it on their teeth with a rag. It seems backward to clean your white teeth with black dirt, but it actually scraped the surface clean. The downside was that it destroyed their enamel and made their gums bleed constantly. They smiled with black grit stuck between their teeth while thinking they were the pinnacle of hygiene. 18. Walking through a medieval city was an assault on your nose because the streets were basically open sewers. The smell of garbage and waste was so overpowering that people thought the air itself would kill them. To survive a trip to the market, wealthy people carried a small bouquet of flowers called a nosegay. They would literally bury their nose in the petals every few steps to filter out the stench of the street. It was not just a cute fashion statement, but a desperate survival tool. If you saw someone smelling flowers, it meant they were trying not to vomit right there on the sidewalk. 19. Making matches in the 19th century was one of the most horrifying jobs in industrial history. Factory girls worked all day dipping wood into white phosphorus, which is a highly toxic chemical that glows in the dark. The fumes slowly ate away at their jawbones, causing a terrifying condition known as phossy jaw. Their gums would swell, and eventually the bone would die and literally rot out of their face. The worst part was that the dying bone would glow green in the dark before it fell off. It was a nightmare fueled by corporate greed, where workers lost their faces just to make a simple light. 20. Taking your clothes off at the end of the day feels great unless you live in the freezing Middle Ages. During the coldest winter months, people believed that removing their layers would let the heat escape and kill them. To ensure they stayed warm, they would actually sew their woolen clothes tight onto their bodies in November. They would not take these clothes off for a bath or a change until the spring thaw arrived. Imagine wearing the same sweaty, itchy wool shirt for 4 months straight while sleeping and eating. The smell when they finally cut the threads in March must have been absolutely nuclear. 21. Beauty involves sacrifice, but squeezing poison into your eyeballs takes dedication to a whole new level. In the Renaissance, women believed that dilated pupils made them look soft and seductive to men. To achieve this dreamy look, they used drops made from the deadly nightshade plant, which is literally a poison. It worked by paralyzing the muscles in the eye, forcing the pupil to stay wide open. While they looked romantic, they were actually slowly going blind and suffering from hallucinations. It is terrifying to think that women were willing to lose their sight permanently just to have a slightly more intense stare across the dinner table. 22. Parents today worry about screen time, but Victorian parents were accidentally drugging their children with hard narcotics. A popular medicine called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup was marketed as a miracle cure for fussy or teething babies. The secret ingredients were not love and care, but huge doses of morphine and pure alcohol. It certainly worked to quiet the child because it knocked them unconscious for hours at a time. Tragically, many infants never woke up because their small bodies overdosed on the opioids. It was sold over the counter as a harmless helper while silently addicting an entire generation of innocent babies. 23. Walking into an American saloon in the 19th century required wearing boots you did not care about. Chewing tobacco was the national obsession, and men felt entitled to spit the juice wherever they stood. The floors of bars, hotels, and even private homes were covered in a slick layer of brown tobacco slime. It was considered a violation of freedom to ask a man not to spit inside. Ladies had to lift their long skirts high just to avoid dragging their hem through the puddles of saliva. It was a bacteria-filled nightmare that spread tuberculosis faster than doctors could possibly cure it. 24. Going to the dentist is scary now, but it used to be a scene from a horror movie. Before precision tools existed, doctors used a crude instrument called a dental key to remove rotten teeth. It looked like a door key that hooked over the tooth and used brute leverage to twist it out. The problem was that it applied massive force sideways, often shattering the tooth into sharp splinters. Frequently, the pressure was so intense it would accidentally break the patient's jawbone completely. You walked in with a toothache and left with a fractured skull and a mouth full of blood. 25. Modern medicine is sterile, but sometimes the best surgeon is actually a squirming fly larva. Before antibiotics, doctors discovered that putting live maggots into a festering wound could actually save a patient's limb. It sounds absolutely repulsive to have bugs eating you alive, but these specific maggots were picky eaters. They only consumed the dead rotting flesh and left the healthy tissue perfectly alone. Soldiers on the battlefield would watch wriggling worms clean their injuries better than any tool could. It was a stomach-churning experience that required nerves of steel, but it beat the alternative of gangrene and amputation. 26. We expect royalty to be clean and polished, but King James I was famously filthy. He had a deep phobia of water and reportedly refused to wash his entire body for years. His skin was said to be as soft as taffeta simply because it was coated in layers of natural oils and dirt. When his hands got greasy from eating, he would not wash them but just wiped his fingertips on a wet napkin. The court had to endure his majestic stench daily. It proves that you can wear a crown of gold and still smell like a peasant. 27. If you cut your finger today, you grab a sterile bandage, but farmers used to grab the ceiling. A common folk remedy for bleeding wounds was to run into the barn and pull down a handful of dusty cobwebs. People believed the sticky silk acted as a natural net to catch the blood and help it clot faster. While spider silk does have some healing properties, the webs were filled with dead flies and dirt. You were basically stuffing bird poop and dust directly into an open cut. It might stop the bleeding momentarily, but it almost guaranteed a nasty infection later. 28. Table manners were a very different concept before the invention of the fork changed dining forever. For centuries, everyone from peasants to princes ate everything with their bare hands, which got incredibly messy. Since paper napkins did not exist yet, people would wipe their greasy fingers on a stale piece of bread. Sometimes they even wiped their hands on the tablecloth or a communal towel passed around the table. Imagine sharing a greasy rag with 10 other people while trying to enjoy your dinner. It was a bacterial buffet where everyone's germs were shared as generously as the roast chicken. 29. We complain about doing laundry, but at least we do not have to stomp around in buckets of pee. The process of cleaning wool cloth was called fulling, and the best cleaning agent available was stale human urine. Workers called fullers would spend their entire day marching in vats of pee to scrub the grease from the fabric. The ammonia in the urine broke down the dirt and made the cloth soft and white. These poor workers went home every night smelling like a public toilet. It was a miserable job that literally required standing ankle-deep in human waste all day. 30. When we think of the Middle Ages, we imagine prudish people, but their bathhouses were surprisingly wild. Public baths were the social hubs of the city where men and women would mingle together completely naked. It was not just for washing because people would eat dinner and drink wine while floating in the tub. You could have a full banquet on a wooden board floating between you and your naked neighbor. It sounds like a fun spa day until you realize the water was rarely changed. You were sipping wine in a lukewarm soup of everyone else's sweat and dirt. 31. Unwanted facial hair has always been annoying, but in the 1920s, the solution was literally nuclear. Clinics popped up across America promising permanent hair removal using a brand new technology called X-rays. Women would sit in front of these humming machines for minutes at a time to zap their mustache away. It worked perfectly because the radiation killed the hair follicles, instantly leaving skin smooth. The problem was that it also killed everything else. Years later, these poor women developed terrible ulcers and skin cancer on their chins. They traded a little bit of fuzz for a lethal dose of radiation because nobody understood the danger. 32. If you have a migraine today, you take an aspirin, but ancient doctors grabbed a drill. Trepanation is the oldest surgery in history and involved scraping a hole directly into a living patient's skull. They believed that headaches and mental illness were caused by evil spirits trapped inside the head. The only way to cure it was to open a window in the bone to let the demons fly out. The most shocking part is that many patients actually survived this brutal carpentry. Archaeologists have found skulls with healed holes, proving people walked around with a breeze blowing through their brains. 33. City life before indoor plumbing was a game of Russian roulette with human waste. If you walked down the street in a busy city, you had to constantly look up to avoid a dirty surprise. People would fill their chamber pots during the night and simply toss the contents out the bedroom window in the morning. They would shout a quick warning, but if you were not fast enough, you got a shower of sludge. It turned the streets into open sewers and made owning an umbrella a survival necessity. You were literally dodging flying poop just to get to the bakery. 34. We hate bugs today, but in the past, fleas were just a constant roommate you could not evict. Women in the Renaissance were so covered in itchy pests that they invented jewelry to fight back. They wore small, intricate tubes hanging inside their dresses right between their chest. These traps were filled with sticky honey or a rag soaked in fresh blood. The idea was to lure the fleas off their skin and into the trap for a sweet snack. It was a gross accessory that turned a fashion statement into a mobile bug catcher. You looked elegant while carrying a tube full of dead insects. 35. The search for birth control has led to some truly desperate inventions throughout history. Before latex was invented, men used condoms made from the intestines or even the lungs of sheep. These animal parts were cleaned and oiled to create a barrier that felt somewhat natural. The worst part was that these organic balloons were time-consuming to make, so they were not disposable. A man would wash his sheep gut out after using it and hang it up to dry for next time. It brings a whole new level of gross to the concept of recycling. 36. Doctors are supposed to be smart, but in the 1840s they were incredibly stubborn. A physician named Ignaz Semmelweis noticed that women were dying because doctors went straight from autopsies to delivering babies. He suggested the radical idea that washing hands with chlorine might save lives. Instead of thanking him, the medical community was deeply offended by the suggestion that they were dirty. They mocked him relentlessly and refused to scrub up out of pure pride. Thousands of women died of fever simply because arrogant doctors thought their hands were too gentlemanly to carry germs. 37. The Victorian era was desperate for novelty fashion, even if it came from the gutter. For a brief and bizarre moment, gloves made from the skin of rats became a trendy item. The leather was incredibly soft and fine, which made it perfect for expensive accessories. It solved the problem of rat infestations while making ladies look chic. Imagine shaking hands with a high society woman and realizing she is wearing the skin of a sewer dweller. It was the ultimate example of turning trash into treasure, but wearing vermin on your hands is a step too far. 38. We freak out if someone uses our toothbrush by accident, but travelers used to share them on purpose. In some 19th century American inns, hygiene was a community effort. You would walk to the wash basin and find a single toothbrush hanging on a string for every guest to use. Hundreds of strangers with rotting teeth and gum disease scrubbed their mouths with that same bristly stick. It was a bacterial nightmare that spread infections faster than a handshake. The idea of putting a public brush in your mouth today is enough to make anyone gag instantly. 39. Roman women were jealous of the blonde hair they saw on captives from the north. Since they could not buy box dye, they turned to the grossest chemistry set imaginable. They mixed ashes with fresh pigeon droppings to create a bleaching paste. The ammonia in the bird poop was strong enough to strip the color from their dark hair. They would smear this foul-smelling sludge on their heads and sit in the sun to bake it. They achieved the golden look they wanted, but they walked around smelling like a pigeon coop. Beauty required looking great, but smelling absolutely terrible. 40. We flush and forget, but before plumbing, removing waste was a terrifying manual job. Houses had cesspits in the backyard that eventually filled up to the brim. A brave worker called a nightman had to come and shovel the human, sludge into buckets. The only way out was often through the front door of your house. These poor guys marched through your hallway carrying leaking buckets of liquid waste while the family tried to eat dinner. One slip on the rug meant your living room was ruined forever. It was the most high-stakes delivery job in history. 41. If you think your hair gel is sticky, imagine styling your hair with bacon grease. In the 18th century, big hair was everything, and the only way to keep those giant wigs standing up was using animal fat. They slathered pure lard onto their hair to sculpt it into massive shapes. It looked impressive indoors, but the second they stepped into the summer sun, the fat began to melt. They walked around with rancid grease dripping down their backs, attracting swarms of flies and gnats. The wigs became literal nests for bugs, so they had to cage their hair at night just to keep the hungry rats out. 42. Parents panic if a toy has sharp edges, but they used to give kids hard drugs. In the 1890s, the German company Bayer released a miracle medicine for children with coughs. They named it heroin because it made people feel heroic and strong. They sold it over the counter as a safe, non-addictive substitute for morphine. Mothers happily spoon-fed pure heroin to their sick toddlers to stop them from coughing. It silenced the cough perfectly because the children were zoned out on high-grade narcotics. It took years for them to realize they were turning an entire generation of innocent toddlers into hardcore addicts. 43. We complain if the shower pressure is low, but at least the water is clean. In pioneer families, filling the bathtub was a back-breaking chore, so they only did it once a week. The father got the privilege of bathing first in the clean, warm water. Then the mother went, and finally the children in order of age. By the time the poor baby was dunked in the tub, the water was a thick soup of black dirt and dead skin. It was so dark you could actually lose the infant in the filth, which is where the phrase "do not throw the baby out with the bathwater" comes from. 44. Fashion is usually harmless, but the Victorian hoop skirt was a literal death trap. These giant cages under dresses were so wide that women could not feel where their skirts ended. They swept across rooms, knocking over vases and brushing against open fireplaces. Thousands of women burned to death simply because their dress caught fire without them noticing until it was too late. It was impossible to escape the burning cage quickly. Churches had to widen their doors just to fit these ladies inside. It remains the only fashion trend in history that killed more people than some actual wars did. 45. If you scrape your knee today, you grab an antibiotic ointment and a Band-Aid. In the past, people looked at their pantry for medical supplies and grabbed a loaf of bread. A common cure for an infected cut was a poultice made of stale, moldy bread soaked in cold milk. They would slap this soggy, yeasty mess directly onto the open wound and tie it with a rag. They believed the mold would draw out the evil infection from the blood. While penicillin does come from mold, this was just rubbing dirty food into a cut. It usually turned a small scratch into a massive gangrenous problem. 46. We love our dogs as pets, but in history, they were sometimes kitchen appliances. The turnspit dog was a specific breed designed with short legs and high energy. Their entire existence revolved around running inside a wooden wheel mounted on the wall. This wheel turned the spit over the fire to roast the meat evenly for dinner. These poor pups ran for hours next to a blazing hot fire just so their owners could eat perfectly cooked beef. If the dog stopped running, the cook would throw a hot coal in the wheel to keep those little paws moving. It was the hardest working dog in history. 47. If you get a deep cut in the jungle, you do not need a needle. Indigenous tribes and desperate travelers used nature's most aggressive insect as a medical stapler. They would find a massive army ant with giant pincers and hold it right over the open wound. The ant would bite down instinctively, pinching the two sides of the skin together. Once the jaws were locked, they would twist the ant's head off, leaving the pincers in place. The head remained clamped shut, acting like a perfect biological suture. It is absolutely gruesome to wear bug heads on your skin, but it definitely kept your insides on the inside. 48. The ancient Romans treated eating like a competitive sport that never ended. Wealthy citizens would throw massive banquets with endless courses of exotic food and wine. When their stomachs were physically full, they did not stop eating because that would be boring. Instead, they tickled the back of their throats with a feather to force themselves to vomit. Once their stomachs were empty, they would wash their face and go right back to the table for round 2. It was a cycle of gluttony and purging that defined their decadence. They literally wasted mountains of food just for the pleasure of tasting it twice. 49. Frontier life required creativity, but this birth control method was just plain nasty. Women in the Wild West did not have access to a pharmacy, so they turned to the local wildlife. They would hunt a beaver, dry its testicles, and grind them into a powder. This powder was mixed with strong alcohol to create a potent tea that was drunk before intimacy. They truly believed that beaver hormones would prevent pregnancy. Imagine the desperation required to drink a shot of liquor mixed with rodent parts. It probably worked only because drinking it made everyone too sick to even think about romance. 50. Hemorrhoids are a pain in the rear, but the old American cure was a pain in the nose. Before modern creams existed, folks believed that the liver of a shark held magical, healing powers. They would render the oil from a shark liver which smelled exactly like rotting fish and death. The patient had to smear this foul, stinking grease directly onto their sensitive areas for relief. It was a trade-off between physical pain and smelling like a fishing boat in a heat wave. You might feel a little better, but nobody would want to sit next to you on the bus. 51. We spend millions on whitening strips today, but in Elizabethan England, rotting black teeth were the ultimate status symbol. Sugar was an incredibly expensive luxury import that only the super rich could afford to eat daily. Consequently, the queen had rotten black teeth from eating sweets all day long. Instead of being grossed out, poor women decided to copy the look to appear wealthy. They used black paste to darken their healthy white smiles on purpose. It was a bizarre world where a cavity-ridden mouth proved you had money in the bank. They literally destroyed their dental health just to fake in a higher credit score. 52. If you go to the doctor for the flu today, they give you rest and fluids. For 2,000 years, the medical answer to literally everything was stabbing you with a knife. Doctors believed that all sickness was caused by having too much blood inside your body. If you had a fever, acne, or even a broken leg, they would slice open your veins to drain the bad blood out. Patients would sit there bleeding into a bowl until they passed out from shock. It often killed people who were already weak from illness. George Washington actually died because his doctors drained half his blood to cure a sore throat. 53. New York City is famous for rats today, but in the 19th century, the streets belonged to the pigs. There was no garbage collection service, so trash and food waste piled up on the sidewalks. The city's solution was to let thousands of feral pigs roam free to eat the filth. These massive hogs would aggressively bully pedestrians and block traffic while munching on rotting garbage. They were the original sanitation workers, but they left their own mess everywhere they went. It was a chaotic barnyard in the middle of a metropolis. You had to dodge angry boars just to cross Broadway during rush hour. 54. Renaissance fashion was all about subtlety, except for the aggressive trend of the codpiece. Men started wearing giant padded pouches over their crotch to emphasize their masculinity. It started as a way to cover buttons, but quickly spiraled into a competition of size and decoration. Some of these pouches were so large and structured that men used them as pockets. It was not uncommon for a man to pull a handkerchief or even a snack out of his pants during a conversation. Imagine talking to a guy who casually reaches into his crotch to offer you an apple. It was the most disturbing storage solution in history. 55. Ancient Egyptian women were pioneers of medicine, but their birth control methods were hard to swallow. They needed a barrier to prevent pregnancy, so they turned to the river for ingredients. The recipe called for mixing fresh crocodile dung with sticky honey to create a thick paste. Women would insert this mixture inside themselves before being intimate with their husbands. It technically worked because the dung changed the acidity, but the hygiene factor was a nightmare. It is hard to imagine feeling romantic when you are relying on reptile poop for protection. It was a very effective contraceptive, mostly because it probably killed the mood instantly. 56. Funerals are sad events, but in Old England, they were also a dining opportunity for the poor. When someone died with a guilty conscience, the family hired a professional sin eater. This poor soul would sit in front of the dead body and eat a loaf of bread and drink ale. The belief was that the bread absorbed the dead person's sins and the eater took them into his own soul. He was paid a few coins to spiritually damn himself for eternity. He was treated like a social pariah because he was walking around carrying the crimes of the entire village in his stomach. 57. Breastfeeding is natural, but Victorian mothers found a way to make it incredibly toxic. To protect their clothes from leaks and keep their nipples soft, women wore nipple shields made of lead. They did not understand that lead is a heavy metal poison that absorbs through the skin. The metal would react with the milk, creating a sweet but deadly syrup that the baby ingested. Infants frequently became sick with lead poisoning simply because their mothers were trying to be modest. It was a tragic case of fashion and convenience literally poisoning the next generation. They were unknowingly feeding their newborns a daily dose of death. 58. If you find a hair in your food, you scream, but Victorian women hoarded hair like it was gold. Every vanity table had a special ceramic jar called a hair receiver with a hole in the top. Every time a woman brushed her hair, she would pull the loose strands out and stuff them into the jar. Once she had collected enough of her own dead hair, she would use it to stuff pillows. They even made jewelry or hair pieces out of the old tangles. It was basically recycling your own body parts to decorate your house. Sleeping on a pillow made of your own shedding is nightmares. 59. The Romans gave us roads and laws, but their bathroom habits were straight from a horror movie. Public toilets were social places where people sat side by side on stone benches to chat. When it was time to wipe, there was no paper, only a tool called the xylospongium. This was a sea sponge tied to a stick that sat in a bucket of vinegar. You would wipe yourself and then put the dirty sponge back in the bucket for the next person. You were literally sharing a wiping stick with every stranger in the city. It was the perfect way to spread disease and awkwardness simultaneously. 60. Doctors in the 19th century loved inventing metal gadgets to fix women's bodies. They created the pessary, which was a metal device inserted internally to support a wandering uterus. The problem was that these devices were often made of cheap metals that were not safe for the body. They would often be left inside for months until they literally rusted shut or caused massive infections. Women suffered in agony as the metal corroded inside them, while doctors insisted it was helping. It was a torture device disguised as medical support. The cure was infinitely worse than the imaginary condition it was supposed to fix. 61. Victorian beauty advice was often dangerous, but using sulfur to remove freckles was just painful chemistry. Freckles were considered unsightly blemishes that ruined a lady's pure complexion. To fix this, women were told to rub their faces vigorously with brimstone, which is basically raw sulfur. This chemical smells like rotten eggs and is harsh enough to burn the skin. The goal was to chemically peel the top layer of skin off to remove the pigment. Women walked around smelling like a geyser while their faces turned red and raw. They were literally burning their skin off with volcano rocks just to look a little paler. 62. Mental health treatment in the 1940s was less about therapy and more about ice picks. Dr. Walter Freeman popularized the lobotomy as a quick cure for everything from anxiety to rebellion. He would slide a metal ice pick under the patient's eyelid and hammer it into the brain to sever connections. The procedure took 10 minutes and left the patient with 2 black eyes and a ruined personality. It turned vibrant people into walking zombies who could stare at a wall for hours. It was a barbaric mutilation performed on thousands of people, often without their consent. 63. We love soft mattresses, but early American colonists were terrified of sleeping lying down. They believed that lying flat was only for dead people and that it might trick their soul into leaving the body prematurely. To stay safe, they slept sitting almost upright in short beds, propped up by many pillows. It was also believed to help digestion and prevent the devil from stealing their breath. Imagine trying to get a good night's sleep while sitting up like you are on an economy flight. It explains why everyone in old portraits looks so stiff and tired. 64. Big hair was the trend in the 1700s, but hygiene was definitely not. Men and women wore massive powdered wigs that they never washed because they were too expensive. These hair towers became the perfect breeding ground for lice and fleas that lived close to the scalp. Since it was rude to scratch your head in public, people carried scratching rods. These were long, elegant sticks made of ivory or bone used to poke through the wig to scratch the itch. You would look polite while secretly stabbing the bugs living on your head. 65. Royalty has always been obsessed with health, but eating gold was a very expensive mistake. In medieval times, doctors believed that gold was a pure and divine metal that could cure depression. Kings and queens would swallow pills made of pure gold leaf or drink tonics filled with gold flakes. They thought the richness of the metal would enrich their spirit. In reality, gold is indigestible, so it just passed straight through their royal digestive system. They were literally flushing their fortune down the toilet. It was the most expensive placebo in history that did absolutely nothing but sparkle in the chamber pot. 66. We think of gargoyles as spooky statues, but they were actually the sanitation workers of the cathedral. Gothic buildings did not have drain pipes, so rain would run down the stone walls and rot the foundation. The gargoyles were designed as long spouts to vomit the dirty roof water far away from the building. The water would shoot out of their open mouths, often splashing onto people walking below. They were ugly monsters for a practical reason, which was to spit dirty water on the street. It was architectural genius disguised as a stone nightmare. 67. Shaving legs is annoying, but using a rock is torture. Before razors were sharp or safe, women used pumice stones to remove unwanted hair. This is a rough volcanic rock that feels like sandpaper. They would rub this stone aggressively against their legs to grind the hair off. It worked by friction, but it also took a lot of skin with it. The result was hairless legs that were red raw and bleeding. It was basically dermabrasion gone wrong in the bathroom. They traded hair for scabs in the name of smooth skin. 68. Dimples are cute, but buying a machine to force them into your face is terrifying. In the 1930s, a device called the dimple maker was sold to women who wanted a sweeter smile. It was a metal spring harness that strapped around the head and dug two hard knobs into the cheeks. Women were supposed to wear this torture device while they slept. The idea was that the constant painful pressure would create a permanent dent in the face. It looked like something from a horror movie and just left women with sore cheeks and bruises. 69. Modern medicine uses pills, but ancient medicine used suction cups and fire. Cupping involved heating a glass cup with a flame and slapping it quickly onto the patient's back. As the air cooled, it created a vacuum that sucked the skin up into a purple welt. They believed this blister would draw out the sickness from the organs. Patients walked around looking like they had been attacked by a giant octopus. It was painful and left massive bruises, but people swore it worked. It was basically a hickey for your health. 70. Table manners evolved slowly, and the fork had a very hard time getting accepted. When forks first arrived in Europe from the Byzantine Empire, the church condemned them as evil. They argued that God gave humans hands to eat with, and using a metal tool was an insult to God's creation. Men also refused to use them because they were considered too dainty and feminine. Eating with a fork was seen as a sign that you were weak or possibly in league with the devil. It took centuries for people to realize that not getting grease on your fingers was actually a good idea. 71. The beauty standards of the 17th century were ghostly pale and strangely specific. Women wanted their skin to look so transparent that you could see the veins underneath. To cheat this look, they used a blue pencil to draw fake veins on their chest and neck. It was an optical illusion to prove they were delicate aristocrats who never went in the sun. They spent hours painting blue squiggles on their boobs to look sickly. It was the only time in history where looking like a road map was considered hot. 72. The Roaring Twenties were a wild time for quack medicine, especially for men wanting a boost. A man named John Brinkley became famous for transplanting goat testicles into human men to cure impotence. He claimed that the glands from a young goat would restore a man's youthful energy. Thousands of men paid a fortune to have goat parts sewn inside their scrotum. It was complete nonsense and often led to terrible infections and death. Brinkley became a millionaire, while his patients became victims of the weirdest transplant in history. 73. We spend a fortune on hardwood floors, but cottage floors used to be made of poop. In rural areas, earthen floors were dusty and hard to sweep. To fix this, people mixed fresh cow manure with water and smeared it over the dirt. Once it dried, it formed a hard, smooth surface that was surprisingly odorless and easy to clean. It sealed the dust down and created a solid floor for the family. It was ingenious recycling, but living on a floor made of dried dung is a hard sell today. 74. Venice is famous for water, but in the 16th century, the streets were filled with mud and sewage. To keep their fancy dresses clean, noble women wore shoes called chopines. These were platform shoes that could be up to 20 inches high. Women towered over everyone and literally could not walk without two servants holding them up. They looked like giants wobbling on stilts just to keep their hem out of the muck. It was dangerous and ridiculous, but it kept the poop off the silk. 75. Cravings can be weird, but in the American South, eating dirt was a cultural norm. Many people practiced geophagy, which is the habit of eating white clay or earth. It was believed to help settle an upset stomach and provide minerals. People would dig up specific types of clay, bake it, and snack on it like chips. While it did provide some nutrients, it also introduced parasites and worms into the body. It was a comfort food that literally came from the ground beneath their feet. 76. The Victorian era was deeply sexist even when it came to basic biology. Public buildings were designed for men, so there were almost no restrooms for women. The assumption was that ladies belonged at home and should not be out in public for long. If a woman needed to go while shopping, she had to hold it or go all the way home. It was a urinary leash that kept women from traveling far or working. They suffered in silence because society refused to acknowledge that ladies had bladders too. 77. Eye surgery requires steady hands, but in the Middle Ages it required a steady tongue. There were medical specialists called oculists who claimed to cure eye problems. If a patient had debris or a cataract in their eye, the doctor would sometimes use his tongue to lick it out. He would literally lick the eyeball to clean it. It was incredibly unhygienic and just plain gross. Imagine going to the eye doctor and having him lean in for a taste. 78. Wrinkles have always been the enemy, but raw meat is not the friend you want. 19th century beauty books seriously recommended sleeping with thin slices of raw beef on your face. They believed the juices from the meat would nourish the skin and prevent aging. Women went to bed looking like a butcher shop display. The only thing this facial attracted was flies and bacteria. You woke up smelling like a spoiling steak instead of a rose. 79. Diet culture has always been toxic, but Lord Byron made it dangerous. The famous poet wanted to look pale and thin to appear brooding and romantic. His secret diet was drinking vinegar mixed with water daily to kill his appetite. It worked by making him physically sick and destroying his digestion. Young women copied him to get that fashionable wasting away look. They were drinking acid to stay thin. It ruined their stomachs and teeth just to look like a tragic poet. 80. Poverty in Victorian London forced people to eat things we would throw away. The poor relied on offal, which is the polite word for animal, organs and waste parts. They ate fried brains, sheep trotters, and tripe, which is stomach lining. It was the only protein they could afford. The streets were filled with vendors selling boiled animal feet to hungry workers. It was survival eating at its most desperate. They wasted nothing because they could afford nothing else. 81. We use creams to fight wrinkles today, but women in the early 20th century used heavy machinery. A terrifying beauty device called the Cloud Aze was marketed to ladies who wanted to iron out their age lines. It was a mask made of rigid metal straps that you heated up and strapped tightly onto your face. It literally pressed the skin flat with heat and pressure like you were a wrinkled shirt. Women sat there baking their faces under hot metal, hoping to look younger. It did not remove wrinkles, but it definitely left burns and permanent indentations on their foreheads. 82. If you have a sore throat today, you take a lozenge but medieval. Peasants went to the garden. The standard cure for a cough was creating a syrup made from the mucus of garden snails. People would collect snails, crush them up shells and all, and mix the slimy goo with sugar. The patient had to swallow this crunchy, sticky sludge to coat their throat. They believed the slime would soothe the irritation better than honey. It is hard to imagine keeping that down without vomiting. You were basically drinking a shot of raw garden pests to fix a cold. 83. Today we flush urine away, but in the past, it was a valuable liquid commodity. The poor citizens of London could actually make a living by becoming professional pee collectors. They would go door to door buying buckets of stale family urine to sell to local businesses. Tanners needed it to soften leather, and laundry houses used it as a natural bleach for clothes. The city had an entire economy based on buying and selling human waste. It gives a whole new meaning to being pissed poor. You were literally carrying gallons of other people's fluid through the streets for pennies. 84. Fleas were such a constant problem in the Renaissance that rich women bought expensive accessories to fight them. They carried a zibellini, which was the pelt of a weasel or marten, decorated with gold and jewels. They believed that the fleas on their body would prefer the thick animal fur and jump onto the dead weasel instead. Ladies walked around petting a dead animal, believing it was a flea magnet. It was a complete myth because fleas prefer warm living blood, not cold dead fur. They were just carrying a dusty, expensive prop while the bugs kept biting them. 85. Medicine in the 18th century was often just random gross things found on the ground. A popular remedy known as album graecum was actually just dried white hyena dung. Doctors believed this specific poop had magical healing properties for skin diseases and colic. They would grind the white chalky turds into a fine powder and mix it into potions or poultices. Patients were paying high prices to eat exotic animal waste imported from far away. It proves that if you package something fancy enough, people will buy it even if it is literally hyena excrement. 86. Booking a hotel room today guarantees you a private bed, but that is a modern luxury. In colonial inns, you paid for a spot in a bed, not the whole bed itself. You would often wake up to find a complete stranger climbing under the covers with you. Hospitals were even worse, with 3 or 4 sick patients packed into a single mattress head to toe. You could be recovering from a broken leg while sleeping next to someone dying of typhoid. It was a bacterial sleepover where personal space did not exist and body heat was shared. 87. People have always looked for love potions, but the Spanish fly was a deadly mistake. This was not a fly, but a toxic blister beetle that was crushed into a powder. It was famous for being an aphrodisiac because it irritated the body and caused a rush of blood. However, the line between excitement and poisoning was extremely thin. Many people accidentally overdosed and suffered kidney failure or internal bleeding just for a night of romance. It was a love potion that frequently ended in a funeral. People risked agonizing death just to spice up their date night. 88. Winter colds are miserable, but the old cure was arguably worse than the sickness. Mothers believed that the best way to protect a weak chest was to grease it up. They would slather a child's chest with thick animal fat, usually goose grease or lard. Then, they would sew a piece of flannel fabric tightly over the grease to keep it in place. The child had to wear this rancid, greasy vest all winter long without washing. The smell of spoiling fat mixed with sweat was enough to clear a room. It kept the cold out mostly because nobody wanted to get close to you. 89. Birth control in the Middle Ages was less about science and more about magical jewelry. Women were terrified of unwanted pregnancies but had zero effective options. A popular superstition was wearing an amulet containing the testicles of a weasel around the neck. They genuinely believed that the magical essence of the weasel would prevent conception during intimacy. It was a heartbreaking reliance on magic that obviously had a 0% success rate. Women walked around wearing dried animal parts hoping for a miracle. It shows just how desperate they were to control their own lives in a world without science. 90. Shoe shopping in the 1950s was a radioactive experience for American children. Stores installed machines called fluoroscopes to help fit shoes perfectly. Kids would stick their feet into the box and look through a viewer to see the bones of their feet glowing green. It was basically an unshielded X-ray machine aimed directly at a child. Parents loved it because it looked scientific, but the radiation dose was massive. Salesmen and children were being zapped with dangerous radiation just to see if a sneaker fit. It was a fun novelty that silently poisoned a generation of feet. 91. Victorian fashion was often creepy, but wearing live bugs was the peak of weirdness. A trend emerged where wealthy ladies wore jewelry made from real iridescent beetle wings. Some took it a step further and wore large live beetles chained to their clothes with tiny gold leashes. The beetle would crawl around on the woman's bodice as a moving brooch. It was considered exotic and fascinating to have a living insect as an accessory. Imagine trying to look elegant at a dinner party while a giant bug is crawling up your neck on a golden chain. 92. We visit museums to see mummies, but our ancestors visited the pharmacy to eat them. For centuries, Europeans believed that ground-up Egyptian mummies were a cure for everything, from headaches to internal bleeding. Grave robbers stole thousands of ancient bodies to grind them into a brown powder called mumia. People were literally cannibalizing history by eating the flesh of ancient kings. The demand was so high that merchants started making fake mummies out of fresh corpses to sell. It was a gruesome trade that turned archaeology into a snack. You were eating a person and calling it medicine. 93. Straight hair has always been trendy, but before ceramic straighteners, women used the laundry room. In the 1960s, teenage girls would literally set up the ironing board in the living room. One girl would lay her head down and her friend would use a hot clothes iron to press her hair flat. There was no temperature control, so burning the hair or the scalp was extremely common. The smell of singed hair filled the house before every school dance. It was a high-risk beauty routine, where one slip meant a third-degree burn on your ear. 94. Men's fashion in the Edwardian era was stiff formal and occasionally fatal. The high, detachable collars worn by gentlemen were starched to be rock-hard. They were so tight and rigid that they could cut off the blood supply to the brain. If a man drank too much and fell asleep with his head forward, the collar could pinch his windpipe. They were nicknamed father killers because men actually suffocated in them. It is the only time in history where a shirt accessory was listed as a cause of death. Being dapper was literally a choking hazard. 95. Fevers are scary, but the folk remedy for them was incredibly fishy. Before Tylenol existed, people believed in drawing the heat out through the feet. The standard cure was to take a salted herring or a piece of ham and tie it to the patient's soles. The salt was supposed to absorb the toxins while the fish cooled the blood. The patient had to lie in bed with rotting seafood strapped to their feet for days. It did absolutely nothing for the fever, but it guaranteed the sheets would smell like a fish market forever. 96. We consider a daily shower essential, but medieval monks considered it a sin. Many religious orders believed that bathing was an act of vanity and focused too much on the physical body. To stay humble and holy, they restricted full baths to just once or twice a year, usually before Easter. The rest of the year, they only washed their hands and face. They walked around in a cloud of holy stench, believing that their body odor was pleasing to God. It was a life of spiritual purity and absolute physical filth. 97. Scurvy was the scourge of the sea, and sailors tried anything to cure it. One desperate theory was that the earth itself had healing vapors that could fix the blood. When a ship landed, captains would sometimes bury their sick sailors up to the neck in the dirt. They would leave the poor men planted in the ground for hours, hoping the soil would heal them. It obviously did not work because scurvy is caused by a lack of vitamin C, not a lack of dirt. They were burying dying men in the mud instead of just giving them a lemon. 98. The Victorian era loved pseudoscience, especially if it involved electricity and magnetism. Ladies were sold expensive electric corsets that contained magnetized metal rods. The ads claimed these magical undergarments would cure hysteria, indigestion, and a curved spine. Women strapped themselves into these heavy, rigid cages expecting a medical miracle. In reality, they were just wearing uncomfortable magnets that did absolutely nothing. It was a scam that preyed on women's insecurities about their health. They paid a fortune to be squeezed by a magnet while their real health problems went untreated. 99. Bedbugs are a nightmare infestation, but colonists tried to turn them into a meal. A bizarre folk remedy for curing a fever or the chills involved the bugs themselves. The recipe called for catching 7 live bedbugs and baking them inside a bean or a piece of bread. The patient then had to swallow this crunchy insect pill whole. They believed the shock of eating the bugs would scare the illness out of the body. It is hard to decide which is worse, the fever or the bug snack. 100. Deodorant is a modern invention, so colonists had to get creative with their body odor. After months of not bathing and wearing wool layers, the smell was overpowering. To mask the stench, men and women would stuff handfuls of fragrant herbs directly into their armpits. They walked around with mint or rosemary bushes crushed under their arms. It did not stop the sweating or the bacteria, it just added a salad smell to the body odor. You smelled like a mixture of old sweat and Thanksgiving dinner. It was a desperate attempt to be polite in a very smelly world. 101. Japanese geishas are famous for their porcelain skin, but the secret ingredient was incredibly foul. They used a traditional cream called ugisu no fun, which is literally made from the excrement of nightingales. The bird droppings contain natural enzymes that bleach the skin and remove heavy makeup. Western high society eventually copied the trend, paying top dollar to smear imported bird poop on their faces. It is hard to imagine feeling beautiful while rubbing feces into your pores. They claimed it made them glow, but in reality, they just had a very expensive face full of bird waste. 102. We are terrified of mercury today, but in the past, it was the standard treatment for syphilis. The disease was so common and painful that people were willing to try anything. Doctors prescribed rubbing toxic mercury ointment directly into the skin or sitting in a steam box filled with mercury fumes. The side effects were often worse than the disease itself, causing teeth to fall out and excessive drooling. The saying went, "One night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." They were trying to cure a venereal disease by slowly poisoning themselves with heavy metals. 103. Sharing a bathroom is annoying, but sharing a towel in the 19th century was dangerous. Most homes had a single communal roller towel hanging by the sink that everyone used. The father, the mother, the children, and even guests would wipe their faces on the same dirty loop of fabric. It was rarely washed and became a damp breeding ground for bacteria. This innocent habit caused massive outbreaks of eye infections like trachoma, which often led to blindness. They were literally wiping the infection from one person's eyes directly into their own every single morning. 104. Vikings are known for their axes and swords, but they also carried a surprising hygiene tool. Archaeologists frequently find small bronze spoons hanging from the belts of Viking warriors. These were not for eating tiny meals, but were specialized scoops for digging out earwax. It seems that even tough raiders were obsessed with keeping their ears clean. Roman citizens also carried similar scoops on their key rings. It is a strange image to imagine a fierce warrior pausing before a battle to dig a chunk of wax out of his ear with a metal spoon. 105. Medicine has come a long way from using actual poison to treat heart conditions. In the past, doctors prescribed a plant called squill to help with heart failure and swelling. The problem was that squill is extremely toxic and was primarily used as a potent rat poison. The line between a cure and a lethal dose was terrifyingly thin. Patients were essentially taking small doses of rodent killer hoping it would fix their heart. It often worked to slow the heart rate, but frequently slowed it all the way down to a complete stop. 106. Pioneers had to use every part of the animal, and that included the brains. When they needed to tan a deer hide to make leather, they did not have chemicals. They used a method called brain tanning, which involved mashing up the animal's own brain. Brain matter contains natural fats and emulsifiers that soften the skin perfectly. They would rub the warm gray sludge into the hide with their bare hands. It is a gruesome fact of survival that every animal has exactly enough brains to tan its own skin. 107. The Victorian era saw a boom in quack devices that promised to restore male vitality. The most famous was the electric belt, which was a battery-powered strap worn under the pants. It delivered small electric shocks directly to the wearer's lower back and groin area. Men believed the electricity would recharge their manhood and cure everything from stomach aches to kidney problems. In reality, they were just walking around getting zapped in the crotch by a heavy battery. It was a shocking waste of money that proved men will try anything to feel strong. 108. Before alarm clocks were cheap or reliable, people hired a human being to wake them up. In industrial England, you paid a knocker up to ensure you got to the factory on time. These workers walked the streets carrying long bamboo poles to tap on second-story windows. Some even used pea shooters to fire dried peas at the glass until the client woke up. It was a subscription service for waking up. The real question is who woke up the knocker up so he could go wake up everyone else. 109. Elizabethan women wanted a face as smooth as an egg, so they used actual eggs. To achieve a shiny glazed look, they would paint their faces with raw egg whites. As the egg dried, it formed a tight, hard shell that smoothed out wrinkles and made the skin look polished. The downside was that the mask was incredibly brittle. If the woman smiled or spoke too quickly, the egg glaze would crack and ruin the illusion. They had to walk around with a stone face, literally unable to show emotion without cracking. 110. Homemade soap sounds charming, but in the pioneer days it was chemically terrifying. The standard recipe involved mixing rendered animal fat with lye water made from wood ash. If the mixture was not balanced perfectly, the lye remained active and caustic. This meant the soap was strong enough to literally burn the top layer of skin off your hands. Bathing was a painful experience where you scrubbed yourself with chemical burns to get clean. You came out of the tub red and raw, but at least you were technically sterile. 111. Going to the dentist is annoying now, but before the 1840s it was torture. Anesthesia did not exist yet, so if you had a cavity, the dentist just used brute force. The patient sat in a chair while assistants held down their arms and legs to stop the thrashing. The dentist would then use a foot pedal drill to grind into the sensitive nerve while the patient screamed. Speed was the only mercy available, so dentists worked furiously fast. It was a nightmare scenario where pain was guaranteed, and the only way out was passing out from shock. If you are grateful that you do not have to wash your face with bird poop today, smash that like button and subscribe to Dumb History. We just survived the grossest timeline ever, but I have to ask, would you rather wear the mouse skin eyebrows or drink the beaver testicle tea? Let me know your choice in the comments. And if you want to see something even crazier, click this video on the screen right now to see the dumbest ways people actually died. Trust me, it gets worse.